Hello everyone, Titanic Animations here, and today I wanted to get started into an explanation into just how this channel went about creating the various real-time animations of Titanic that it's made. And I want to give a shout out to Kitty Crystal for the suggestion to make this video. So it all began basically one day in 2011 or 2012, I can't remember. A friend and I were sitting around and talking in TeamSpeak while watching Titanic videos online, and the subject of a real time sinking came up because up until that time there were no real, at least relatively accurate, real time sinkings of the tragedy on YouTube. Most of them seemed to be little time lapses, or they were straight up recreations of the 97 movie, and almost none of them were in proper real time. The most accurate one at that time had been taken from James Cameron's 2012, The Final Word animation. But the problem with that was they had taken a 2 to 3 minute animation and then they had stretched it out to be a 2 hour and 40 minute animation. So, yeah, the former creator and I on the channel, we got talking, and within a couple minutes, we decided, you know what, we're going to make a real time syncing based off of our knowledge of what happened. The problem was that both of us had been absent from the Titanic community for a good while. I myself hadn't kept up to date with stuff since the release of Ghosts of the Abyss in the early 2000s, and the other creator had a bit more knowledge than me, but I didn't know enough. She didn't know enough. We were both in over our heads and pretty much had no idea the enormous can of worms that we just opened. So anyway, we slapped together the 1.0 version and put it online, and that was in 2015, December 1st. So it had taken nearly 2 to 3 years at that point, and it was bad. Oh, so bad. Like, if you're watching or listening to this right now, do not go to that page and watch the video. It is literally that bad. It's a complete waste of time. Um, and the funny thing about that is all of the captions and subtitles, those were put in via the YouTube annotations, if anyone remember those. And they're not even around on the platform anymore. YouTube has completely removed annotations from its platform. So it's literally just a 2 hour and 40 minute video of nothingness. There's no captions to explain what's going on. There's no time. It's just it's bad. So we both agreed that we had to do something better. And so the idea was launched to do another one. And that led to the first fully real time, since the original first one from 2015 only covered up until, I want to say, when the bridge goes under, or maybe up until the breakup. But I know that it didn't do the entire sinking. So we wanted to be able to do the entire sinking. And during the production of this version, which was being made in 2016, Honor and Glory released their first real time animation. And we both watched it, and the creator and I felt that it was a bit inaccurate in some areas, something which Honor and Glory themselves have admitted due to it being rushed. I think they said they had like 8 or 10 days to get it done, which is insane. So both of us agreed, because of that, we should keep working and finish it rather than just giving up, throwing in the towel. The problem is that, just like the last one, as soon as we uploaded it to the platform, we hated it, and it was agreed that we had to do another version. So we both split up and had jobs at that point. Instead of both trying to step on each other's toes and do the same thing, we agreed that my job was simply research and find as much info and as much stuff as I could find and compile all of that together, whereas the other person was in charge of compiling the animation, getting the models together, and keyframing and stuff like that. So we kept on compiling all of that knowledge, the tools that we had at our disposal, until at last what became known as the revised real-time syncing animation started to take shape. And a primary source of information for that was, and the remastered one, by the way, are the research essays of Samuel Halpern, and one of the best books on Titanic available, On a Sea of Glass, The Life and Loss of the RMS Titanic by Tad Finch, Bill Wormstead, George Behe, and J. Kent Layton. So we started to compile everything into what I call a master timeline script, which is actually available to read, by the way, in the remastered video's pinned comment. On a Sea of Glass took center stage, and all the other research material was overlaid on top of that. So if we found something that didn't line up with what was written in the book, it was discarded. Uh, Simple, cut and dry. If it can't agree with what On a Sea of Glass is saying, we we threw it out the window. So as soon as we started work on it, the most glaringly apparent thing that needed the most work were the angles of the ship while sinking. And if you go through the inquiries, various survivor accounts, and the book itself, you'll see that very few people actually mention the ship's angle or the list at all. They'll say variations of stuff like, I do believe there was a list to one side or another, but very few actually mention, what degree they think the ship was at. And that's further complicated with trying to place, okay, well, when did that happen? And where was that passenger when they said that? So on and so forth. Um, and that became very hard. Another reason why we wanted to get the angles of the ship knocked out as soon as possible is because with both prior animations we had had problems with that. With the first one, the ship didn't move vertically in the water at all. It was just a bow angle, you know. And with the second animation from 2016, that one the ship did move vertically in the water, but in order to match up with every single survivor account of what they said they saw the waterline doing outside the ship would move down in the water and then back up out of the water. And we knew that that wasn't supposed to happen. So this time we wanted to fix that and make it at least as accurate as we could get it based on the research material that we had. And the research essay Trim and Heel by Samuel Halpern was used here as a general guideline to maneuver the ship while it was in the water and while it was sinking. So next came, it was up to me to find every single mention of a list or ship angle inside of On a Sea of Glass and any other material that we had on hand. And that led to us including things like the 2.5-degree initial list to port before the collision, the quick 5-degree list to starboard after the collision, and so on and so forth. So one of the difficult things after that was trying to figure out exactly when that starboard list, the one that occurred directly after the collision, trying to find out when exactly that starboard list turned into a port list. Because all the documentaries that you watch will simply say, well, when the water reached Edek and began flooding Scotland Road, but that doesn't really serve us any help when we have the ship model because it doesn't have an interior to base that judgment off of. And the ocean plane is a simple little plane that goes through walls. So it's not like it's actually flooding the ship. So that doesn't really help us. In the end, I think I wound up using the last confirmed mention of the ship's list to starboard by, I believe it was either a passenger or a crew member inside of On a Sea of Glass's timeline. I can't pinpoint exactly the moment or the minute that that survivor account took place, but it gave us a general idea of, okay, this must have been when the ship started from starboard to port. And next came Titanic's port list, which we know was around 9 or 10 degrees, thanks to Cameron's 2012 documentary and the survivor testimonies from crewmen in Boat 10. Able-bodied seaman Frank Evans testified that as loading in boat number 10 got underway, that children were having to be thrown for him to catch and then place into the lifeboat. And when he was at the inquiry and he mentioned this, they asked him, well, why did they have to throw children to you in the boat? Because normally the lifeboat was around a half inch away from the ship's side. And they had already documented that there was a starboard list, so the lifeboat should have been up against Titanic's hull. There should have been no reason for them to toss a child into the boat for him to catch. And he said, well, the lifeboat was 2.5 feet away from the side of the ship, which would indicate a port list. So luckily, Samuel Halpern did a little bit of geometry in his trim and heel essay, and he showed that if Evans was right in estimating that it was indeed a 2.5 degree or 2.5 foot gap between Titanic's hull and the lifeboat, that would indicate approximately a 10-degree list of port. James Cameron in 2012, I believe, said it was 9 degrees. So I settled in the middle. The animation says that it's a 9-degree list of port, but it's actually a 9.5 degree list of port, just to meet in the middle between Evans and Cameron. One thing I'd like to note is that pretty much the last 20 minutes of the ship sinking after 2 a.m. were the most complex parts of the animation. Because basically, everything is its own object. The ship is one object. Every single lifeboat is an individual object. Even though they don't move because we had animation problems, every single lifeboat davit is an individual object. The funnels are an individual object. The wires that break off of the funnels are individual objects. You see, everything is its own individual object, and everything has to follow the ship or else it's going to hover in midair, which doesn't look very good. Up until 2 a.m., the ship has been moving very gradually and slowly, so it's pretty easy to make sure that within the span of 5 minutes, all the objects move with the ship accordingly. But when the ship starts moving fast after 2 a.m., we were now tasked with trying to keep, I believe it was somewhere in the vicinity of like 25 or 30 objects moving in unison with the ship and have it look as if everything is one big thing and it's completely invisible to the naked eye. Like you can't even tell that there are multiple objects in the scene apart from the apparent ones, which are the lifeboats. So, in that regard, that was pretty much the most complicated part of the entire affair. That was insane. I think it took, I want to say, 6 months of animating and programming just to get those 20 minutes finished. And again, it's not even a very highly detailed scene in animation. It's just basic movements and stuff. We didn't even try and get it applied for physics and stuff like that. We didn't do any of that. We just wanted stuff to move, and it still took us 6 or 8 months or something like that. I remember it taking over half a year just to get those last 15 minutes, 20 minutes rendered. It was insane. But we powered through it, and we finally had a somewhat accurate base movement timeline as far as the ship movements were concerned. So now we had to do another pass of the ship's movements to further refine that. So the basis for the initial flooding minutes were taken from survivors who said that they saw the waterline inside the ship after the collision. Stuff like Annie Robinson seeing water coming up the staircase, Mr. Boxhall seeing water coming up the staircase. The general rule here for placing the ship in the water was the waterline outside the ship can't be below where the waterline inside the ship is because gravity doesn't work that way. So as long as the caption read, something like water is seen on F deck, and you show exterior wise that water is up to E deck, that's okay. But if you have the same caption, water is seen on F deck, and then on the exterior you show that water is only up to G deck, that can't happen. So it was fixing little things like that, and I found a few problems when trying to make sure that the exterior waterline always matched up to what survivors were saying. What's one example that I can? One such glaring problem is at 1:15 a.m. Okay, Lookout Simmons is famously quoted as saying that he saw Titanic's nameplate submerging into the sea when rowing past it at this time. He was in emergency boat 1, I believe, or just simply boat 1. Um, so a lot of people interpret that as Titanic's actual name is going underwater, right? But I had to account for some gaps. I had to account for the delay in the lowering of lifeboat number 1 because, believe it or not, when they were lowering, they got caught on a guy wire or a coaling wire or some type of rigging wire, and it actually delayed the lowering of the boat for some odd minutes. So I had to calculate how long they were actually sitting there, not being lowered to the ocean. And then once they were in the ocean, how long would it take for them to row far enough for him to see Titanic's nameplate submerging into the sea? And then I had to make do with the biggest incongruency there, which was the fact that some of the sources that I had mentioned that it was the nameplate specifically submerging into the ocean, but others say that it was the row of portholes under the nameplate, which would be the D deck row of portholes. So that's one instance where stuff doesn't quite line up and you have to make a judgment call. That's a big discrepancy. That's like 5 or so feet in height. And it's a big difference in how far the ship is sitting down vertically in the water, the bow angle. To get either one of those lined up correctly, that's a big difference in ship angles and the vertical height of the ship down in the water from it being just the name going into the sea to the D deck portholes. And ultimately, I believe we went with using the D deck portholes because it more closely aligned with the general guideline of what was provided in the Trim and Heel essay by Samuel Halpern. So we continue to refine the ship's movements that way, making judgment calls, trying to make the ship's waterline adhere to what passengers reported at certain times. But there were some occasions to where we simply couldn't make stuff line up, or they flat out would not line up. Another such example of that would be the testimony of Officer Boxhall in boat number 2. As boat number 2 was lowered, they rowed a good little distance from the ship. I believe he said it was 100 yards. And then Captain Smith got on his bullhorn and basically started trying to call boats back to the ship. And his boat, I believe, was the only one that responded. Uh, and as he began rowing back, Captain Smith said, "Come around to the after gangway on the starboard side." So instead of rowing around the front of the ship, where you run the risk of, in his mind, suction, he goes around the back of the ship, the stern. So he begins rowing his boat around the stern, and somewhere around 2 a.m., he said that they rounded the stern. And as he did, the propellers were, according to him, fully out of the water. And he couldn't even tell if they rode under them or not. They were so far out of the water. And then once they got around to the starboard side, he made a judgment call and said, "I think that so many people are going to try and jump into this boat that it is not worth doing it. Plus, the ship is going down faster and faster. We need to get away in case there's a large suction." So they begin to row away from the ship. But all of that happened at around 2 o'clock, according to him, somewhere, give or take 5 or 10 minutes, around the 2 o'clock timeline. The problem with that was, on our model, the propellers were still partially submerged at that time, almost halfway submerged. And yet, according to Boxall, they were fully out of the water. So it seems like an easy solution of, well, just increase the bow angle until they're above the water, or just raise the ship up vertically until it's out of the water. But the problem with that is now everything prior to that moment in the animation does not line up with what survivors said happened. And everything after that moment does not now line up with everything that survivors said happened. And that's why sometimes in the video, you'll see captions in it like Mr. Boxhall's saying he sees propellers all the way out of the water, but the reason why you're not shown the propellers being above the water is because by our calculations, I'm not saying that we got it right and that Mr. Boxhall was wrong, but simply by our calculations, something is wrong either in the movement of the ship or the timing of Mr. Boxhall's remarks because they weren't above the water according to the way that we had tried to make the boat and the ship adhere to the movements that everyone else was saying. The lifeboat lowering times were gathered from James Cameron's 2017 documentary. I believe it was called Titanic 20 Years Later. And inside of that, they actually did a practical lifeboat test. In it, they showed that it would take around 8.5 minutes to unfurl a boat's canvas, prepare it for launching, rise it out of the chocks, crank out the davits, and then lower it to the level of the boat deck. And then they went a step further and they weighed the lifeboats down and showed that it would take approximately 2 minutes to lower a lifeboat 10 feet, or every minute 5 feet. So, since that was a practical test performed with a nearly full-sized replica and almost exact replica of the davits and everything that was actually on Titanic, and it was being performed by experienced crewmen, that was good enough and valid for me and the other creator to say, okay, that's what we're going to go with. So the timing of how long it took each boat to get to the water was based on that, except for in boat five's case and boat one's case, and it may have been another boat where they said that lowering was halted. The overall sequence launching timeline was taken from On a Sea of Glass, which, that's how we know, okay, this boat lowered first, and then this boat, and then that boat, and then so on and so forth. The breakup was modeled after Royman Gott's theory, as I personally thought it was interesting, and the fact that it included a research essay behind it said to me, hey, this isn't some made up nonsense. It actually has some plausibility behind it, some physics behind it, so it's not like it's some, crackpot weird thing that's been spat out there. It actually had some merit to it. And plus nobody else had ever portrayed the breakup in that way. So I said, you know what? Let's do it this way. Uh, One of the things, actually the thing that I see the most comments about on the video are the music and the ship's wireless signals. So I'll start with the wireless signals first. I want to be clear, though, in saying that I do not understand a single bit of Morse code other than SOS. I don't know what Morse code, no, I'm just, no. One of my jobs was using a Morse code chart and any other Morse code translators to translate uh, Titanic's Morse messages into a program that would spit it out into an audio file. Um, so some of those were taken from On a Sea of Glass, and the majority of them, and the bulk, I would say about 95% of them, were taken from Dr. Paul Lee's Titanic pages, where he has an entire list of all of the wireless signals. But the problem is they're written in English. Uh, and we found out the hard way that if you take an English sentence and translate it over into Morse, and then translate that into an audio file, and then put that into the animation timeline, that stuff starts to overlap. And stuff did overlap on that night. But you'll have an instance of Titanic saying a distress message, and you have someone responding to the distress message before they even finish sending the distress. It was literally like being inside a room with like 20 R2D2s going off all at once. It was insane, it was nerve-wracking, and we both just sat back and was like, we have to fix this. So what I learned is Morse code operators use abbreviations. I did not know that, but I learned. So something like Titanic calling Olympic, CQD SOS CQD sinking. Uh, if you had that as a Morse code message, you now had to find the abbreviations for everything in that message. So Titanic turns into MGY, which is the ship's call sign. Calling turns into CLG. Olympic turns into MKC. CQD and SOS remain the same. And for some words, I could not find an abbreviation. So for the word sinking, for instance, I couldn't find an abbreviation for sinking. And so that was translated into SNK. So instead of Titanic calling Olympic CQD SOS CQD sinking, I now had MGY CLG MKC CQD SOS CQD SNK. It's very weird, and it's almost like, well, it actually is like learning another language, and I do not know it. I just want to make that clear too. I had an entire chart of abbreviations, and again, if I could not find an abbreviation for a word, I had to make one up. So the Morse code messages, the messages themselves, the captions on the screen are accurate to within, I want to say, a minute or so of when those messages actually took place. But as far as the actual beeps and dots and dashes, those are probably about 75% accurate because they may have used another form of abbreviation. We may have got the abbreviations entirely wrong, but we basically just did some research, tried to find proper abbreviations, and use those. So, yeah, it was many, many long nights sitting up listening to basically R2D2 scream in my ear before we got everything finished and right. The ship's music was actually one of the most easy things to do, all things considering. There's a wonderful essay by George Behe called "The Music of Titanic's Band," which is included on his webpage, or Mr. Wormstead's webpage, but it's also included in On a Sea of Glass. And that lists a great number of songs that were heard by survivors as the ship sank. We know generally that the band played upbeat and ragtime songs, but then they transitioned from upbeat songs into gentle and more softer songs as the night went on. That's not to say that they didn't play upbeat songs later in the sinking. For instance, a female passenger inside of boat D noted that she heard Alexander's ragtime band playing as that boat began to launch, and that was, I believe, at 2:05 in the evening or in the morning. So I took all of the list of songs from Mr. Behe's essay and I arranged them according to tempo to get somewhat of an insight into just what Titanic's band may have played, or most likely played during that night. And the next task was up for the other person to find non-copyrighted versions of those songs to place into the animation, which they didn't ultimately do. They used copyrighted versions, and that's why if you go now to the revised syncing version, you'll find that there's large gaps of silence in the animation because I was forced to remove that copyrighted audio so that the video could stay up on YouTube, which is ultimately what led to the remastered version where I went through and added in more sound effects and more dialogue, and then I replaced all the copyrighted audio with non-copyrighted audio. So yeah, other than that, the music was pretty much one of the most easiest things to do, all things considered, when compared to everything else that we did. Another little thing that's often overlooked about the revised and both the remastered syncing is the ship's lights. We actually went through and tried to figure out, okay, which public rooms douse their lights at certain times. So all of the lights that are turned off were approximations of what actually will be turned off at that time. And also, every single passenger's cabin, we used the deck plans from Encyclopedia Titanica to find out, okay, exactly where were these people positioned, which person was in an exterior cabin where you could actually see whether their light was on or off. And then we matched that up with on a sea of glass to where, okay, this person said that they were asleep during the collision, so we had their light turned off. And if they said, I was awakened by the ceasing of the vibration of the ship's engines, that's when we had their light turn on. It's unfortunate that the co creator chose camera angles that basically did not show any of this, but it actually is something that is in the animation. You can only see it, I think, very briefly. Right as the collision is occurring, there are a few lights on B deck that turn on. There's a few lights in the bow that turn on from crewmen being woken up. But if we had actually pulled the camera back away from the ship, you would have actually been able to see around 50 or so lights around the bow, the starboard, and port sides of the ship that just flickered on as the collision took place and in the minutes immediately following the collision. Once we had all of that done, it was rendering time, and basically my work was finished. I had compiled all the research, I had done all the Morse code messages, and everything else was just rendering. So the other person started rendering and they said, hey, I just did some calculations or whatnot. It's going to be 3 years of rendering before we get this thing finished. I've been looking into using a render farm, but it's going to cost money. So I was wanting to know if you could help pay. And I said, yeah, sure. So I wound up paying for part of the render farm usage since the other creator couldn't afford to pay for it all by themselves. And to my knowledge, it went at about a rate of 10 minutes or so of footage per month. And I believe the entire animation is somewhere around 160 minutes. So that is like 16 months of rendering nonstop. Uh, and the rendering progressed at a very slow rate. We had to restart from scratch once because there was a keyframe issue with the waterline of the ship, even though we had tried to refine stuff as much as possible. In the first pass through of rendering, we noticed that as Molly Brown's boat was lowering to the ocean, she said that she saw water flowing in open portholes on D deck. But yet, on the exterior waterline, the ship was only up to E deck in water. So we actually had to go through, fix the ship, fix every single keyframe after that moment with every single object, and then start rendering again. So we had to restart on one occasion and fix that, which that was my fault. Um, but it was fixed relatively quickly. I think we got it fixed within a week, and then rendering started again. And there were a few pauses and hiccups, but mostly the job was done after that point. It was just up to rendering everything off. So all in all, I would say there are 5 books, over a dozen research articles, essays, papers, 7 documentaries, the help of others, feedback from YouTube commentators, long nights, never-ending days of frustration, 6 years of constant refining. and probably enough coffee to keep the entire economy of Colombia running to produce the real-time animations that you see on this channel. And it would not have been possible without any one of those elements whatsoever. Because again, this just started out as two friends talking on TeamSpeak and saying, you know what, we can do this.